So we have with us Jody Thompson, and he's going to be presenting on managing invasive shrubs and vines. And so Jody is a research and extension associate with Kentucky State University, has worked in natural resource systems management throughout much of the Southeast and lower Midwest. His work focuses on land management practices and their effects on the health of forest, pollinator, and sustainable farm systems. Jody's current projects include comparing site preparation methods for pollinator habitat, drone assessments of invasive forest plants, and land management effects on pollinators and native invertebrates, land management training, and agroforestry demonstrations. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Jody.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds great.
Awesome. All right. Well, those were some great presentations so far, and thank you all very much for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this. I'm going to continue this topic that Logan started, and Logan has a lot more to say about this topic. I just want everybody to know. So if you have questions or you need something done, you should really reach out to him. So with that anyway, I'm going to focus on managing invasive shrubs and vines specifically. Okay, there we go. So, and what I'm going to hone in on is it's really about how to work efficiently depending on scenarios, and then a little bit of detail about how to actually do the treatments. And fortunately, Logan covered some of those treatments at the same time, so I'll repeat a little bit about what he said. So in regard to working efficiently, some really key points, and this kind of works across fields no matter what you're doing, it's really to group your tasks whenever possible. And by that, I mean, when you're working on, and this is really something that helps when you're working on large areas with a lot of plants or something like that, and you have multiple tasks, you don't want to be moving between cutting and treating and back and forth, cutting and treating and dragging all at the same time. You want to do as much cutting as possible, and then group as much treating as possible, do as much piling as possible, and so on and so forth. And two, we've seen this theme so far, it's also is use the best bang for your buck tools and herbicides, and that's always situation dependent. So all herbicides, for example, all broadleaf herbicides don't work equally as effective across all broadleaf shrubs, and so on and so forth. So it really helps to, look up some expertise, talk to folks who are doing this, and really read the labels. And that's something you really need to remember too. No matter what recommendations we give you, the king of all information is that product label. There's a lot of time and effort put into it, and we may all have our nuances, our tips and tricks that we prefer, and make some of our own adjustments, but overall that label gives you what you need to know. So we're going to start out with short plants, and Abby here in this picture is demonstrating what I mean by a short plant. Abby probably at this time in her life was maybe 5-ish feet tall, and you'll see that Chinese privet she's holding there is that's a size you'll find in the woods, lots of different things. And if we take something like bush honeysuckle, it's a very common size that you'll see mixed in with other plants in forest. So when you're dealing with short plants, we're usually dealing with a couple of scenarios. You're dealing with short plants that are scattered. That means there's not necessarily a lot of them growing close together. Then you'll find short plants that are growing really densely, lots and lots and lots of plants in one area. And then, but more often than not, you really see mixed heights of these things. But when you're dealing with scattered short plants, and some of you may recognize this from your own properties or projects you're working on, when you're dealing with these short plants, you have a couple options. If you're a homeowner or a landowner that prefers not to use herbicides, or if you're working on a property where herbicides may be a certified organic farm, for example, where herbicides are not, or effective herbicides are not an option, hand pulling is an option. And this is really most effective when these plants are below like knee or thigh height. Once they get taller than that, they become much more difficult to pull because of an advanced root system, because all these plants are perennials that we're talking about here. And especially if you're working in dry soils, it becomes much more difficult. Probably more effective is a foliar spray. active ingredients with triclopyr 3 or 4 or glyphosate are generally very effective, especially on plants this size. And you want to target your foliar sprays during the growing season. Now, the thing about a lot of these invasive plants, especially your invasive shrubs, are they have a longer leaf out period than other things. So you may actually see leaf out in March, or you may see plenty of leaves on a shrub in November. But if those leaves are starting to fade and they don't have that, intensive green color, that healthy green color they would like in the middle of summer, your foliar treatments are going to be less effective in that regard. Dense short growth. So short plants again, that there's a lot of them over the landscape. This becomes less effective for hand pulling because there's so many plants, because it's so much work, and you're just really prone to injury. And when you're working with this many plants, maybe on a site that's even a fraction of an acre, but for a lot of us, we're working on properties that are over an acre, or multiple acres, many acres. It's really not feasible to be doing that type of labor over that size of an area just because of the physical aspect of it. Foliar treatments are probably most effective just from an operational scenario, just a work efficiency scenario. And now you can also do cut stump treatments on plants this small, but you want to be more particular with the herbicide solution you're using because you're treating such a small area. These very, very short plants, you're talking about stem diameters of less than ½ an inch usually. I would favor something if I was doing a cut stump treatment on these short plants, which I would not normally recommend when you're working over large areas. But if you are doing a cut stump treatment on very short plants, I would suggest favoring something with like a triclopyr 4 in some kind of basil oil, because you'll be able to treat more surface area of that stem. And what that basil oil does is it helps the herbicide penetrate the bark. So you have more surface area for treatment uptake in that situation. Now, sometimes what I'll do in a site that has lots of short plants, when I'm working on a site like this, there's usually a high potential for non-target effects. Another way to think about that is collateral damage for the native plants that you care about more. So to avoid some of that, especially if you're working during the growing season, one tactic you can use is use a brush cutter, which if you're not familiar with what a brush cutter is, it's essentially just a brush blade on a trimmer, or you can buy these commercial models that are designed to be brush cutters, and they have metal blades that cut through those woody stems. What you can do in this case, if you have a high potential for non-target effects or that collateral damage I was talking about, you can go through with your brush blade and just cut the very short plants and not treat. And then you can save your treatments for a later time when the native plants maybe have died back for the season. And what that does is, and this is more something that if you're treating in the springtime, like mid to later spring or early in the summer, you're just wanting to get light on the ground, because what these invasives do predominantly is they cast too much shade, and that's predominantly what suppresses our native species, our native plants. So if you can go in and just get the plants out of the way, knowing that you're going to have to retreat, that can be an effective option, because there are ideal times to be treating these plants, but we're often working, our schedules don't always allow that. So sometimes we're just treating when we can. We're kind of taking what we can get in some cases. All right, so here's an example of a bush honeysuckle with smaller stems. And I'm bringing this up just to show you that this is a great size. These stem diameters are less than an inch in diameter. So this is a great size for a brush cutting blade. So like I said, any kind of residential or commercial trimmer will usually handle some kind of brush blade. Commercial trimmers are better. They'll just handle the punishment more, and they're usually, higher horsepower. You can get, like I said, larger brush cutters, but these, commercial model brush cutters and clearing saws, they can be very expensive. For example, you can pay $1,500 for a single piece of equipment to do this. But this is a treatment method that this tool, the brush cutter, is something that's not commonly used in by landowners. You know, but it's a really great tool. It's something that allows you not to lean over very much, like you have to do if you're using a chainsaw, for example. There's lots of squatting and leaning over to move stuff, mostly just to cut. So, but consider something with a brush blade for these smaller things. It'll make your life so much easier. Here, Abby is demonstrating what a tall plant might look like. So a tall plant for me is just really anything that's over my head up to, you know, these larger heights. And behind her is a bush honeysuckle. And bush honeysuckle can get very tall, you know, 12, 15 feet. Well, you know, some of you may have seen larger bush honeysuckle. I don't think I've cut anything taller than 15 feet myself. So, but when you're dealing with scattered tall shrubs, you have more options. You can foliar treat those just fine, although the risk of non-target effects is pretty high. The most effective thing to do on these, though, is a cut stump treatment. And really the process you want to use there is to cut the top part of the plant out of the way and then go back and cut down to the stump. And when you're cutting the stump, I always recommend cut as close to the ground as possible so that your herbicide treatment is as close to the roots as possible. It's just more effective that way. When you're dealing with mixes of tall plants, so when you're dealing with scattered tall shrubs, you're always dealing with both a mix of tall things and short things. And so get the tall stuff out of the way first, and then your next task that you want to group is to work on the smaller stuff. And with the smaller stuff, you would follow up with either a cut stump treatment or a foliar spray. Here is dense tall growth. This is a park in Frankfurt. This is East Frankfurt Park, for those of you who know this spot. So with dense tall growth, lots and lots of tall plants over an area, you're almost dealing with, you know, canopy, the shrub canopy is closed, it's lots of shade, there's very little natives of any sort, sometimes not even any fallen leaf litter on the ground under these situations. Foliar sprays are usually not an option with this, unless you're dealing like maybe a fence row or a hedgerow or a very narrow line of plants. But when you're not dealing with a narrow line of plants, you won't get effective foliar coverage in this kind of situation. So this is, in almost all cases, best approached using a cut stump method or using a forestry mulcher. So cut stump on really large plants, which always have a large base, it's most effective with a chainsaw. It's just the way it is. Reciprocating saws, or sawzalls, if you know them by that name, work very effectively, but you usually have a limit to what you can do. They're not as effective at the close to the ground where those stems are very, you know, several inches in diameter. So we usually recommend chainsaws for this, but they make great electric chainsaws too. Don't have quite the generally in the same price range as gas-powered saws, but you need to have lots of extra batteries to do a long amount of work with it. Forestry mulchers, like I've mentioned, these are usually pieces of equipment. They have these cylindrical barrel mulching heads that usually go on the front of skid steers. And when you have a large area and you're treating some of these woody plants, this is sometimes one of the most efficient ways to get that stuff out of the way. And this thing does a great and efficient job. You can rent these pieces of equipment, or you can hire service providers that'll do it for you, but you have to schedule follow-up foliar treatments after the forestry mulcher. The downside, the benefit of using a chainsaw is you can treat right then, and you can be careful and take it as you need to, as far as the amount of time you need. You can take it slower, but the downside of the chainsaw is just a whole lot of work. I mean, this is a lot of work doing these large plants. So anyway, keep that in mind. When I've done a little private work, once you get past or even approaching maybe 2 acres and over 2 acres, and you're working with a small crew, or one, let's just say maybe 2 people, sometimes it's actually could be more cost effective to get a forestry mulcher in there and spread your treatments out, doing the mulching first and then following up with a foliar spray. So you need to consider that in your planning, not just the effectiveness of the work, but what folks can actually afford at the same time. So this is the base of an autumn olive, and I just really wanted to demonstrate how big these plants can get. That particular autumn olive was probably over 10 foot tall, over 10 foot wide. Now, when they're open grown, meaning there's not plants growing right next, other shrubs growing right next to them, or they're not growing under shade, that particular, a shrub that size, that could be 20 foot tall and 20 foot wide. But when they're growing next to each other, it can be a little smaller. But you do a lot of work to get to the base of this plant. And when you're doing your cut stump treatments, you want to treat every cut surface. You don't want to leave a plant like this. And you really don't want to treat a plant in this condition either. It's too easy to leave parts of the vascular tissue untouched. And what that means is you won't kill enough of the roots, and then you'll have resprouts. And in, a few more years, you can have a giant plant again. Instead, go ahead and take the time and cut this thing all the way back to a very low stump and treat that surface. So this particular stump shows a plant that was, maybe 6 to 8 foot wide. The crown of it was 6 to 8 foot wide, and I cut it all the way back and cut and treated every single surface. And each of those arrows in this image points to individual stems that needed to be treated. If you don't treat each of those stems, you run the risk of this plant resprouting. You don't want to throw all your efforts away after you spend all this time doing this. And that's very, very common with this kind of work, is to see efforts like this not treated appropriately, or many times not treated at all. Sometimes you'll cut these things back, or maybe you're working with volunteers, maybe you're volunteer yourself, or maybe this is new to you, and you'll do the cutting and you'll think, well, I just cut it. Sometimes we hear, if you cut these things back enough, it will kill them. That almost never happens. So almost in every case, these things will resprout if I go back and cut it a dozen times in a couple of years, even, because those roots will continue to grow. And these things are called invasive for a reason. Another thing you'll notice is that it's blue. So every time you're doing cut stump treatments, basal bark treatments, like Logan described, also that Eric brought up, you always want to use some kind of spray indicator. So the product you buy may not be called dye, it may be called like turf marker, spray indicator, or something like that. It tells you where you've been, because it only takes a few plants before they get buried in the leaves and the dirt and the debris, or the color just blends in with the ground. So you don't want to go very far in your treatments in your cutting before you actually do your treatments. Use a dye, it will save you a lot of headache. It may turn you blue or green or purple or yellow, depending on what dye color you're using, but it's worth it. All right. Initially, when Ellen had brought this topic up, she had asked about maybe covering winter creeper. So winter creeper, well, let's just say climbing vines in general, and the ones that most of the time we're dealing with are things like winter creeper, Japanese honeysuckle. Some of you may be dealing with porcelain berry. I don't have experience with porcelain berry myself, but I have plenty of experience with Japanese honeysuckle and winter creeper. They should, in some cases, be treated like a shrub or a small tree. So in this picture, most of the mass climbing on that tree is a winter creeper. It's probably got multiple growing points at the base of the tree, and then it just climbs. So height is not a limit. And it's this stage with this plant where it flowers and then fruits. And if it climbs, that's when it's going to spread to outside areas. So when you're treating these, you really don't want to do a foliar spray on this. There's no point. You can cut this without treating, and everything above that cut point will die if you get all the vines. But you still want to kill everything that's growing in the ground. You still want to kill the roots of this plant. So you need to treat these with a cut stump treatment at the same time. Basal bark really won't work on this plant. And if you do use a basal bark treatment, you run a high risk of treating the tree that it's growing on also. So you want to be very careful when you cut through this, because it will be attached to the tree, and then do a cut stump treatment on it. to get the vine that's growing out of the ground. Now, with the winter creeper specifically, these things can get several inches in diameter. And once they get over a couple inches in diameter, all those tendrils that are attaching it to the tree become almost impossible to pry them off. It's very, very difficult. So more often than not, you'll see projects where these are left on the trees just because they're so difficult to remove. So, but treat this like you would a small tree or a shrub. Do a cut stump treatment on it, and do not treat the vine that's growing up the tree. There are vines in the southeast and in our, in the eastern U.S. that sometimes you do need to treat growing on trees. Kudzu's one, for example. There's certain climbing ferns that you might need to do this with, but most of the time in Kentucky, in this upper South, lower Midwest region, the way that I described is the way to handle this. Now, winter creeper, also by its name, it creeps. So everything green in this picture is winter creeper. Everywhere that there's a node, like where the leaves come out, and so basically a million places along these vines become rooting points in the ground. So it's very difficult to hand pull this effectively because you're leaving so much broken and so much in the ground. At least I haven't witnessed an effective hand pulling project when working on a large scale infestation anyway. Some folks have tried smothering, and maybe in very small scales where you combine smothering and hand pulling together, you might see some headway on small scale situations, but usually it's not going to be quite as effective. The most effective way to treat this is a foliar spray, and this is a plant we usually don't recommend. We usually recommend using like a triclopyr 4 on this. Now, this plant has a thick, waxy covering to the leaf and to the new growth, so it can be very difficult for water-based herbicides to penetrate the foliage to then be taken up into the roots. And so one thing you can do with this is you can add a penetrating surfactant. There's something called pincher bark, which is designed to work with water-based herbicides, water-soluble herbicides, to help those herbicides penetrate tougher tissues. You can also add methylated seed oil to your herbicide mix, and that methylated seed oil, being oil-based, will help the herbicide also penetrate the tissues of the plant to be more effective. Another reason that I used this picture was to show the water. So the triclopyr 4 you shouldn't use if there's a risk of exposing to water. But you can use methylated seed oil with other things like triclopyr 3, for example. And I learned recently from Joe Millen at UK that you can get aquatic approved methylated seed oil products also. All right, I'm just going to cover a couple of things before I leave a little time for questions in case y'all have any. Your sprayers are very important. When we're working in the woods and we're doing cut and treat methods, all are not created equal, especially for cut stump treatments. The one I have circled is the one I highly recommend, not necessarily that brand, but simply this type of pressurized spray bottle where with these adjustable nozzles. This particular one will work, it holds close to half a gallon, put it like that. So you get a lot of bang for your buck with this treatment. It's pressurized. You don't have to keep working that trigger to get it built up again, to get the pressure built up again, to get that vacuum built up again anyway, to treat. And so I can cover a lot more space. And if I'm doing cut stump treatments with an oil-based solution, and I am working in an area with the occasional very small tree of heaven, I can use that same solution, that 20% triclopyr 4 in oil, that will work on very small tree of heaven at the same time. Yeah, so backpack sprayers I use less often for these situations, but if you're working in teams, if you're working on a crew and you can divide your tasks and you're covering a lot of area, you can also use backpack sprayers for cut stump treatments and basil bark treatments. For all these, avoid the cheapest models. They won't hold pressure well, they're more likely to leak. So just keep that in mind. You get what you pay for with the equipment. All right. Short and sweet, I hope. And I hope that was helpful to some folks. That's my contact information. I'd encourage you really to reach out to Logan or to reach out to me if you have questions. If it's something we can't answer, we probably know the folks who can. With that, I'm going to wrap it up and turn it back over to you and see if anybody has questions for Logan or me.
All righty. Well, that was excellent, Jody, for a whole slew of information on the proper tactics to battle these invasive plants. And so I just wanted to open it up and another big virtual round of applause for both Jody and Logan for that spotlighted information on those specific invasives. And I wanted to open it up for a panel discussion. We have a lot of questions, but I wanted to bring Joe and ask him as the timekeeper if we have time for that.
Let's give it a couple minutes. Yeah, I'll do like 2.
Okay, awesome. All righty. So we have some that have already been answered, but there are some open ones, and I'll leave this to both of you all. Have you heard of anyone using aerial spraying for autumn olive with success?
I'll jump in there first. I don't specifically, but I have, there are projects down in coastal states where they do it with Chinese privet very effectively. And I have seen a couple of examples, maybe out of Indiana, with folks doing aerial spraying of bush honeysuckle. Logan, do you have any extra info on this?
I was just going to mention the same things you already did. So it's being done similar things, but maybe not specifically autumn olive.
Yeah, so it might be beneficial because in certain situations, autumn olive is usually found in higher, more open, more sunny sites. And it covers lots and lots of acreage really fast. So if in those open situations, there might be a case for it. But it really depends. It's kind of difficult to do aerial spraying when it's done in the woods. It's done in cases where you have to do it in the off season, where you can get through the foliage, and there's just a lot of room for collateral damage. So you just really need to plan that project very carefully.
Excellent answers from both of you. All right, so one more question, and then we'll have to leave the rest for you all to answer within the Q&A. So Keith mentions here that his grandpa used to paint cut stumps with 2,4-D and diesel fuel mix. And he's wondering if this works on autumn olive and honeysuckle, or if he should use something else.
2,4-D is not necessary for autumn olive. 2,4-D lasts longer in the soil and has, in some cases, greater non-target effects than like triclopyr and glyphosate. So diesel and kerosene were the original oil-based carriers for these things until we got basil oil products. Use basil oil if you can. But painting the stump too, that's sometimes this is the term that means treating the stump. I've talked to lots of folks, and I've known lots of folks who work with open containers, literally painting, the stump. Don't do that. Always use closed containers and treatment tools. But 2,4-D is a broadleaf specific herbicide. And so for autumn olive, 2,4-D would work just fine. However, it's just not necessary. We have stuff that works just fine and just as well, has fewer issues, and are very effective. Logan, do you have any comments?
No, man, you're crushing it. That's exactly that's exactly.
Now in other situations, 2,4-D, sometimes it's hard to do without it, especially like native warm season grass habitat and pollinators. But woody plants, most of the time, it's just not necessary. All right.
Well, thank you both again. And, do check in the Q&A because there are several other questions waiting there for you. And just to wrap up our invasive plant session, I wanted to highlight a certain organization that we have here in Kentucky, and that is the Invasive Plant Council. And we are always looking for new members to join our team to help us fight the good fight against these bad invasive plants. And so I know I won't take much time, but please, if you're interested in learning more about invasive plants in general, what they are, what they look like, and then their management options, please check us out. We have our website and you can use that QR code there. And we'd love to, have new members. So I would encourage folks to check that out.